Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Peter and I talk with Brittany Ernst, who is just completing her PhD and defending her dissertation at the University of North Carolina in the same field that Peter and I have enjoyed practicing for decades. In her case, she's just starting out and will be moving soon into a practice in a corporate setting where she will be testing out many of the theories that she's so successfully proven that she understands, and a whole lot more that she'll be discovering. Brittany Ernst. Well, today is an exciting day for me because Brittany Ernst was my student. It wasn't too many years ago. I think we figured maybe 8 years ago. And now she is on the verge of defending her doctoral dissertation in organization science and moving out into the practice world as a choice over the academic world. So it's really fitting to have this conversation today, Peter. But I want to say that one thing that I have always thought about when I've thought of Brittany is that she has like a fire coming out of the top of her head. If you were to look in through a camera infrared lens into a room, you'd see the heat.
Are you okay with this, Brittany?
Yeah, I think there could be worse things coming out of the top of your head.
She is, am I making you a superhero here, Brittany? But the idea of us getting our arms around bringing in practitioners is each one gives us an impression that hopefully starts off the conversation. And Peter just asked you the first question. What do you think about me saying you got a fire coming out of your head? And what does that mean to you in terms of who you are and what's gotten you here this wonderfully short and rich route?
Yeah, so I think that it's very accurate and reflective in terms of the way that I view kind of learning and my approach to just working and becoming better, more educated overall. So of course I pursued my undergraduate degree in psychology and, was made sure to stay very, very busy while also pursuing a full-time softball scholarship on the team at Central Connecticut and, pursuing internships in the summer and just constantly looking for more ways to learn and understand different people's experiences and what work was like for them. So, I started working at a pizza place when I was 16 years old and realized that work is unique. Everyone experiences work and their managers and their leaders differently, and have always been interested in understanding what that looks like for different individuals, and has now blossomed and expanded into my graduate study where I'm focused on leadership and how people interact with their leaders and what this looks like when we interact via technology. So that's one of the main areas that I've focused on too. But I think you're definitely accurate in your assessment, I guess, of me, that something that has always driven me is just a constant state of wanting to learn more and experience more and learn from as many different people and contexts as I can.
Fascinating. Well, Brittany, this is Peter. I warn you that the metaphor that I've always used is when speaking of a learner, a very intense learner like yourself, is that a person burns with a hot blue flame, I always used to say. Mm-hmm. So we're in the same universe, metaphoric universe, Dave.
I never would have guessed that was what
these fire metaphors.
Yeah.
I also have to say that I'm looking forward to this conversation because it takes me back to my doctoral days, and particularly in the later stages when I think I finished my dissertation, the last two chapters and all the proofing and all that of my dissertation. I think I went to, like 2.5 days without sleep.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I just had this explosion of energy to get the dang thing done. And during that time, I came up with the metaphor that writing a dissertation is like climbing over a barbed wire fence in a mohair coverall. Every move you make, something snags. But it does get done, and there is life after D for dissertation. Mm-hmm. I hope David and I are 50 or 60 years beyond our own doctoral experience, our testimony to that.
Peter was my dissertation advisor, and I was thinking that my experience having Peter coaching me was that I was going over that barbed wire fence naked. That's my recollection. The scars. Yeah, I have the scars to show it. Talk a little bit about your experience now that we've been so insulting.
No, it is interesting that, as times and maybe the theories and the data available and these things change in decades, but the general experience and the foundation of it seems to be relatively stable, and that I think myself and a lot of other students in my program can kind of relate to this metaphor that you're describing. And it's definitely not an easy process, and I definitely have felt that sense of taking a couple steps forward and then a bunch of steps backwards and hitting snags and problems along the way. And I think one of the really important pieces of advice that I've gotten along the way from older students and faculty members is that a good dissertation is a done dissertation, and there's no such thing as a perfect dissertation. So I think that it's important to recognize that it is just one of the steps in this lifelong journey of learning and gaining more experiences. And it's not that once you finish your dissertation you're done learning and done exploring and done researching. It's just one step along the way, and that's the step that I'm at this current moment, and definitely looking forward to the end of it. But then, of course, using those skills to continue moving forward and understanding and investigating different problems, collecting data from different sources, answering all kinds of questions. And yeah, definitely looking forward to the done dissertation, not the perfect dissertation.
Well, you said something in your first set of remarks, Brittany, that caught my attention. Something about leadership and technology and how leaders interact with technology, and you said that was a special interest of yours. It's a special interest of mine also, partly because I went into my doctoral work with an MBA behind me, and the immersion in organizational problems that you get with an MBA. Whereas so many of the OD people that I have worked with over the years come out of either a liberal arts background, or they're ex-theologian, ex-ministers, or they're ex-human resource specialists of one kind and another. They're scared to death of technology, and they're naive about it. They think it's inhuman and a threat to healthy human functioning in the organization, and they keep it at arm's length at all costs. And the result is seems to me they miss an awful lot. And talk a little bit about what that connection is for you.
Yeah, sure. So it actually, at the origins, I guess, of where I became interested in this whole phenomenon of virtual leadership and what it's like to interact with, a manager who's located somewhere other than where you are, and your only means of communication is what we're doing here. So, Skype and video and phone and instant messaging was when I interned for Duran back when I was an undergraduate. And at the time, the company was a totally virtual, remotely dispersed company. So I was working as an intern, but was actually working from home and communicating with my team and my boss and my manager through instant message and weekly phone calls. And occasionally we would meet together in the office, but of course it's not the same as going into the office and interacting with people face to face every day. So
Sure.
that was kind of where my interest was sparked, I suppose. And then I realized, in graduate school where you kind of have the freedom to explore any issue within the realm of organizational science, organizational behavior. And this was something that was definitely understudied in the literature. In the early 2000s only was probably the first era that researchers were starting to publish these studies on how to become an effective virtual leader and what it means to lead in a global virtual environment. And a lot of the research and recommendations were things around, make sure to check in on these remotely located team members and don't just let people fend for themselves. You have to initiate more check-ins than usual and set very clear goals and guidelines for them and establish trust. And basically what it boiled down to was most of the recommendations and most of the empirical findings were suggesting that some form of face-to-face communication, whether it's initially or at some kind of regular cadence, is still pretty essential for having that team functioning and effectiveness. So I think that initially they started to notice this in the early 2000s when this research was just kind of coming to light. And some of the research that I've done in the last couple of years where I've looked at specific leadership styles, and my focus is on charismatic leadership. So, leading with emotions and metaphors and trying to inspire people through this motivational language, which we know for sure has worked in person in a face-to-face context. But at least in my studies and the couple of initial studies that are out there, it appears that this is not actually working in a virtual setting. So if your boss is giving this motivational speech, but it's through a webcam, then it might actually not have the same effects as it does if they were giving you that same speech in person in the office.
Yeah.
So I think there's something interesting there.
I think you're right. And you say the dissertation itself is looking at that behavior or case studies of it or survey?
So it's actually a laboratory experiment with where we've trained an actress on charismatic leadership behaviors, and we have her deliver a speech that does or does not contain those charismatic leadership behaviors. And we're testing both in an in-person context where we have people interacting face-to-face, and then also in a virtual context where they're interacting with a video, just kind of like we are now. And it's really cool to compare those different effects.
And you found out what? Because if we're not warm here now and fuzzy and able to have a virtual hug, then we're not very charismatic. But I'm fascinated. What did you find out so far, at least, as you're writing this up?
Yeah, so we found that in the in-person portion of the experiment, people under the charismatic leader, they performed better on a task. They produced more output on a simple task where we had them create something out of paper supplies. Mm-hmm. And people were more likely to stay for an additional 15 minutes and do extra unpaid work when they were working for that charismatic leader versus when they were not. So not only are people performing at a higher productivity level, they're also willing to do extra unpaid work, which is pretty exceptional. And then at least in the preliminary results of the virtual study, we are not seeing any significant differences between people who were working under a charismatic or a non-charismatic leader. So regardless of which speech they were.
So what you found out is the ones who were in the virtual setting, their performances were basically what, less than the live, or?
When we compared the two groups in the virtual setting, the groups are indistinguishable. So regardless of which leader they were working under, they have an equivalent performance, and there's no difference in the extra work that they were willing to do. It's basically the exact same across the conditions. But so we still don't know exactly why that might be the case. According to some of the survey data we have, people do perceive the charismatic leader to be more competent. However, they're still not working harder for her. So we're still trying to untangle exactly what's happening here. But my interpretation and my takeaway is that, we cannot just take the traditional leadership theory and findings and things that we know about leading in organizations and just apply that to an online interaction and assume that everything's going to work in the same way. Because clearly it's not, at least in this study and some other preliminary studies. And if you talk to anyone who's anecdotally worked for a leader in that environment, I would imagine that you would get a similar response from them too.
It does lead me to jump ahead to a mythical human resource department where they've got, let's say it's a large corporation, and they've got 50 individuals who they're doing leadership training so that these individuals can function as leaders in a virtual environment.
Mm-hmm.
And they spend a lot of money trying to help these people become more charismatic and more lively and more stimulating, when in fact your preliminary data seems to show that money is not well spent, that they would do just as well to let people just be themselves as leaders in the virtual environment.
Yeah, precisely.
It does kind of cry out for explanation, though. It's an anomalous finding, and to me, intuitively anyway, and kind of fun to follow up. It's always fun to have a dissertation topic where you can get a few articles out of the dissertation for, say, the first 5 years into your practice,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a lively little literature on it for organizational consultants, as you probably know, practicing consultants, not academics.
Sure.
The OD practitioner, for instance, I think it's renamed itself now, but that's a lively little journal.
I'm going to pause. Okay, so we were talking about we were talking about the bringing some pertinent articles out of Brittany's dissertation, but let me use this as a moment to say that she is very likely to be moving into practice in an organization of the size you mentioned, and that's several that she's been looking at, where virtual managing and leading is going on, both within the country and beyond. So, Brittany, you may be actually being a contributor to why our virtual remote leadership systems are not producing quite as much as we'd hoped. Is that true?
Yeah, I think I think it's definitely only going to become more prominent. And even these corporations and these companies that are, even if you're based in the United States and all your employees are in the United States, or even in the same office, with all of these trends now, with not just millennials, but the workforce wanting to be more flexible, and with such a tight talent market, it's important to offer these benefits to employees where they can work from home occasionally if they need to, or can work remotely from other parts of the country. And I think that it's only going to be inevitable that everybody is ultimately working in some kind of virtual arrangement with their coworkers, with their leaders. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time to be studying this concept, and I look forward to bringing some of the knowledge and the data that I found, and hopefully being able to apply that into practice and into the workplace, and seeing, of course, I have the perspective of a lab experiment, but what does this actually look like when I'm inside of it and inside of a corporation? And it might be a whole different story. So comparing the two different sides of that will be interesting, and hopefully there's some overlap and places for both of us, both parties, to learn more and improve those interactions.
Yeah, I was going to, actually, that was going to be my next question, is how you envision your first months or few years of practice with your degree in hand, and whether you were going to go out on your own, or you were going to go to work for somebody and be a member of a team somewhere, so it strikes me that given the digital revolutions that we're living through, the ground itself is moving, as a metaphor that was offered a few years ago by an organizational scientist named Eric Trist. The ground itself is moving. That is, the assumptions we're making about how some system is going to work. The system itself is evolving. It's like a living thing, and that seems to be the case with technology and virtual communication and so forth. For instance, we're going to have more and more. We'll probably have robots as team members, and
I'm laughing, but it's probably true. Be true.
I'm sure it's happening somewhere right now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Who are there may be it may be a box without any arms and legs, but it's a team member in the sense. Well, this machine that IBM calls Watson seems to participate in conversations quite freely. So that will be, maybe you'll be doing leadership development with robots to try to humanize them and make them better team members before you're very far into your career.
It's very possible, and I think that it's interesting that, even in something like human resources, where one of the key words is human, we're not necessarily immune to that, and things like artificial intelligence and machine learning are certainly working their way into a lot of the practices within human resources, and a lot of the times it's through, selection formulas and ways to kind of narrow down candidates for a certain role, or ways to optimize workforce planning and succession planning based on different kinds of algorithms and things. But I think, to your point, it's definitely inevitable, and all we can do is just kind of continue to learn and hang on and try to add that human perspective so that things don't become too cold and artificial in that sense. But I do hope to, in my first, couple months, to your original question, my first couple months or year in the role, and I'm still, this will be my first time in a full-time position. I've done a couple of internships and graduate assistantships and some nonprofit consulting throughout graduate school, but I think the first couple years will really be a time for me to sit in that role and really understand how HR and how my role or my team, whatever that may be, really fits within the organization, and understand as many different people and teams' experiences that I can. And ultimately, and I think Doc may have mentioned this, that my longer term plan is to get into organizational development consulting, and whether that's my own practice or partnering up with someone who maybe has more experience, expertise than me to give back and consult in that way. But I recognize there's still lots to learn about how all the pieces kind of fit together before jumping into a role like that. And I think that some of the feedback I've gotten too, that you can't necessarily be an effective consultant until you kind of understand how all the pieces fit together and how all of these different roles interact with one another. And that's something that I really look forward to learning in my first couple years in a full-time role and within a big, complex organization, ideally.
Well, yes, and your own interpersonal skills as a consultant are crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And I would urge you not to overlook that aspect of the whole process. Your own sensitivity to other people's attitudes, feelings, motivations, expectations. I had a blinding glimpse of the obvious myself here just within the last, year or so, after 40 years or 50 years of consulting myself and studying it. And organizational change was my original field in my doctoral work. My blinding glimpse of the obvious is that the effective consultant is somebody whom the client looks forward to meeting with and having back, and is fun to work with, which is not a terribly technical concept, but there isn't much fun these days in many organizational environments. And the consultant who brings some hope and some inspiration and maybe a few laughs along with all the technical superstructure is more likely, in my opinion, to be effective. All the best consultants that I know are men and women who are fun to work with, fun to have back, rather than, oh God, it's Monday. That's right. It's the
Here comes that consultant
third
again.
Monday in the month. Oh, that's right. Our contract says we have to spend the day with him or with her, and that consultant isn't going to hold that contract for very long, I wouldn't think. Even though that person may have enormous volumes of technical skill and knowledge, but that person he's confused two things. Confused is the content value of him or herself as a consultant, and the interpersonal process value. And the interpersonal process value is, that's my phone, and I don't know where it is. I'm in bed, and it's in the bed somewhere.
I'm going to pause this for a second because this is a really good riff. Oh, is that what that phone ring was?
Whenever they score, that horn sounds.
Do you actually get to hear it at all, Peter, when you're watching the Vikings play?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, they score. Oh, okay. I'm kidding. He's too passionate about that football team since he's a Minnesotan by birth and now by residence. Brittany, Peter put out a very interesting scenario for the successful versus the unsuccessful OD's consultant. I can tell you, when I was going to have a consulting gig years ago, I called Peter and I said, Peter, you got to give me some advice because I've never done this before. And I think he gave me the advice maybe he'd been given. He said, whatever you do, be authentic. Remember that, Peter?
Yeah,
be authentic.
I do.
Yeah, and I had to figure out what the heck that meant, but I think fundamentally, you are you when you're out there, and while you have the slides and the other accoutrements and the doctorate, being asked back is a pretty key thing. Even within a corporate world where you're going to be doing some consulting as part of your HR service, that's going to be an interesting test of a lot of aspects of you, not only you, but what you studied. You call it charisma. Maybe it's just what you picked up in your studies as being an engaging person and what it means for the other to feel engaged. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this kind of reminds me of some of the studies that I've done in the space of leadership and kind of the evolution of how psychologists and management scholars have thought of, what it means to be a good leader. And initially, back in when leadership was originally studied using a lot of military samples and looking at, leaders in the very formal sense of a leader in the Army, for example, and they would study what are the traits, the innate traits that people have that you're born with that we can then test and select for, and that's how we're going to identify our leaders. And as the field and the research has moved forward, I think that people are becoming a lot more open-minded and receptive to this idea that, okay, so maybe it's about 50% of the traits that are innate, stable qualities, but another 50% of it is your environment and things that you can consciously train and develop within people. And I think that's where a lot of the value is in the work that I do, the work that we do, is that there are certainly some traits and some qualities that maybe you have or you don't have, or you have some baseline level of, but where it really gets interesting. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this in terms of the interpersonal skills for consultants, but to what extent can we actually train and develop this in people? While still recognizing that some people are naturally very charismatic. Not everyone is Oprah Winfrey or Barack Obama when they get up and speak in front of a crowd, but we can certainly train people and give them tips and tactics and skills to practice in order to get better and enhance those things. So I guess from your perspective, where does the idea of becoming, an authentic, interpersonal, effective consultant, where does that fall on the spectrum of either you're just born with it or you're not, or it's something that you can really train and get better at over time?
My attitude about it, I'm sure you have some thoughts, Dave, but my attitude about it is that in the experience I've had, I've been in a lot of environments, training environments, where, or you might call them personal growth environments, where your, how to put this, your awareness of yourself, you take for granted. I am who I am, who I am, as Papa used to say. I had a professor in grad school myself. I took a course in listening, Carl Rogers' theories of interpersonal relationships, and deriving from his own consulting practice as a therapist. And this professor of mine used to say, once you get that the other person has a consciousness and sense of self that is just as rich as your own, once you get that, you'll never be the same, he used to say. And it didn't, I won't say I got it in that course, but I began to gradually get over the years how rich another person's world is. By golly, just as rich as my world. How about that?
Can you imagine anyone whose world is richer than mine?
and that realization then excites your own your own curiosity to, or hopefully it excites your curiosity to learn more about that world of the other person. And to learn about the world of the other person means you've got to learn to get out of the way. You've got to learn to listen is to learn to get your own head out of the way. And that's no easy trick. Not at all. It happened to me actually right here in this conversation. When you said you were interested in leadership and technology, I went boing, and then I didn't hear about the next 5 minutes of what you said. Because my own head went off boing on my own interest in leadership and technology. And that happens so subtly, yeah, and persistently that it's valuable to become aware of how your own sensitivity, your own mind can do that to you. I don't know. I'm not being terribly articulate about this because it's difficult to talk about. The processes are difficult to talk about. But in the best instance, you get it that your client is a different person with a different set of needs than your own, different understandings and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of reminds me of another project I worked on for my master's thesis. I was also looking at, virtual interactions, but instead of a leadership context, we were interested in how people interact in groups online, so social groups like forums and chat groups. And we found that one of the important predictors in people's perceptions and satisfactions in a group were that people felt that they were being seen by other people. Yeah. So, we have this fundamental human need to want to belong and be seen and be heard by other people, but this was even more true online, and it stood out among all of the other different features and forums of this website that the one thing that people really cared about most was that if they're online and interacting in this chat forum, whether it's anonymously or not, that they wanted some confirmation that other people were in fact seeing them and recognizing that they were present and that they were there. So I think that really speaks to your point about, understanding another person's consciousness, and that someone else on the other side of the computer screen has their own world and their own experience that it's important for us to acknowledge and try to understand that to the extent that we can. It's really interesting.
Fascinating. And I would say that that's where you're going to start to learn something new as a practitioner, or even as a teacher consultant, that as soon as you open up the space for that person to come through to you, there's a whole lot you can learn in an instant almost about the realities of life. I'll take you very quickly back to your pizza store when you were 16. You said in your self-introduction that you were noticing customers, you were noticing coworkers, you were noticing all these different ways of experiencing the desire to buy or sell a pizza. And yet you made something of it, and it somewhat moved you into the realm of psychology and then eventually our world of organizational science. So, yeah, what do you think? Where would you like to take us in this next section of time, Brittany? Because you are on the verge of moving into most likely to the corporate sector. Well, I'm not even going to let you answer that. I'm going to tell you something. You didn't choose to become a professor. And now the question is, how come?
This is not a setup question.
I feel like Hannity now on Fox. You didn't. What the hell's wrong with us that you didn't want to be a professor? And you were with a lot of professors there at the university. Didn't they charm you into a life of our world?
They certainly try. They certainly try, and we're exposed to that career path in great detail, and I think we get a very realistic job preview of what it's like to be a professor and to be a full-time academic, and they definitely encourage students to stay open-minded to pursuing either path. But for me, I think it was probably after my first corporate internship where I was interning in between my freshman and sophomore year of undergraduate, and realized that just the fast pace of working in that environment really stuck with me. And being an athlete and being very results oriented and goal driven, and kind of the pace of working on a team most of the time in a corporate environment really appealed to me, and the ability to see a project through from start to finish in a matter of a week or a couple of weeks, and be able to quantify your results and present findings quickly and see the impact of things right away. Whereas sometimes in academia, some of the projects and work tends to be a little bit more, I guess, slower paced, sometimes slower paced, or it's not necessarily, there are team projects for sure, but there's a lot more independent and contemplative work. And quite frankly, writing is such a huge portion of the academic career path, and it's not necessarily one of my favorite tasks. I think I am a good writer and maybe even above average writer, but I wouldn't say that it's one of my passions. I really thrive and enjoy doing and delivering results, and I think that that's part of what has drawn me to a career in industry, and specifically in a corporate environment, at least for the first part of my career. And
do we forgive her, Peter? Do we forgive her?
She's done a lot more thinking about this than I did.
She's been thinking like this since I met her when she was a sophomore. She is very intentional.
Intentional is a good word for it.
And it really, truly fits that you are an athlete, and you remain athletic in the sense that you're continually doing fitness development and so forth. You like results, don't you?
Yeah, I think results and data to back it up, and trends over time, and just the next challenge and the next big project or the next way that I can contribute for the team, for the company, and drive results. And
are you living next to a train?
I do. I apologize if you can hear that train. We live right across the street from a big train that goes through a couple times a day.
Are you on the right side of the tracks?
And we're right on the ground level too, so it's basically like it's going by my window. I can actually see it out there.
Well, this will all be part of the fun of this conversation. But I think one of my senses of you and of practice itself is that the intentions are not born overnight. That they maybe, like your conversation about traits versus environment. There's some things that you've used to define your own sense of well-being that have continuity right to this moment and out into your next year or so into the corporate world. You like getting things done. You like the action. You like the people who get things done. Are we missing any of your likes here?
I think one of and this is not necessarily exclusive to industry and practice, but I think one of the ways that I kind of describe my approach to work or to learning in general is the idea of solving puzzles and putting the pieces together, both in the literal sense. So, I enjoy doing like a jigsaw puzzle on a table, but as well as, approaching a puzzle, whether it's in the form of a research question. So figuring out, okay, here's our question, here's our puzzle, what makes leaders effective in a virtual environment, or taking that into the work or applied industry context. And their question is, okay, we have a 40% turnover in our managers at this location. What do we do from here? So I think that's one of the pieces or one of the perspectives that I've taken into all areas of my work and school, is just approaching things as a puzzle where there is maybe one right answer or maybe multiple right answers, because there could be the case in either one.
Or missing pieces, which is the research.
Which is also often if you knock a piece off the table and your dog happens to pick it up and walk away with it.
Oh, she has a very large dog, Peter, in which you do not fight. You do not fight that dog to get that piece out of his mouth. So what do you think, Peter, about this notion that she loves puzzles?
Well, I don't know. It's a mentality that I think is going to be very valuable in the complex and contingent world that you're going to be moving into. Of course, almost every organizational world these days is full of complexities and contingencies, and to think of it as a dynamic puzzle that is got an organic capacity to it's not going to hold still. It's not a closed system, as one of my friends used to say. Where the game of chess is a closed system. You don't import anything to the game other than the players. And but a game that changes in its very structure and its very nature as you play it. I guess there are some video games that do that now, and grow and learn right in front of the player's eyes. But that's the kind of puzzle that you're going to be immersed in. Plus the fact that even as I speak, I think it's also the case that there will be elements that in the game that we can't even conceive of. And I was just watching a movie last night of a novel called Revolutionary Road that I had read years ago, and I was interested in what the movie had done with the novel. And the key character in the novel works for a business machines company, and it's in the 60s, and he's a worker bee. He's several levels of management down from the top. The top people see the computer revolution coming. He doesn't see the computer revolution coming. He thinks he's going to be selling adding machines for the rest of his career. And so the top people are trying to inspire him or convince him that an unbelievable future awaits him if he will please stay with the company. I got disgusted with the actors and turned it off before I found out what decision he made, and I don't remember from the novel.
But that was very predictive of the 60s when Peter and I first met each other, and there were a lot of resistances. But you'll find the same as you move into some of the companies here in Connecticut. Should you come back this way, there's still thousands of people working in those companies who are still grumbling that they have too much software on their computers to have to learn and deal with. Then you've got some others, like those who've come out of our school, Central Connecticut, who were in there ready to rock and roll. And some of them now have become part of their agile systems and companies around here. There's a lot more awareness that insurance now has to move faster than the speed of the next claim. And so whatever industry you look at, it's all about what your practice is designed to relish. So I think you're on the right track. Now, don't totally close the door to be joining us in the academic world someday, at least for a rest. How's that? But I have to use this point to say, though, that even the school that you're in and the departments and programs that you're part of, the ground is moving under them as well. They are, as Peter has coined it back in one of his first books, they're in permanent white water and they're moving fast. So academia may not be the place to rest in the future. So you might want to hold on that on that piece of advice. Have you noticed some of that change even in the 4 years or so you've been there?
Yeah, I think for sure. And I really like this metaphor of the permanent whitewater. And I think, of course, it applies to both, being in industry and also in academia. And I think one of the biggest areas where it's affected me, at least most directly, is in my first year of the program, we were being trained in our research methods class using SPSS software for data analysis. And now in my fourth year, they've stopped using that altogether and everyone has moved toward R, which is an open source data analytics and management and visualization software that is constantly being updated by users all over the world. It's completely free, open source, where anyone can access it and you're not paying for it. And there's so many resources out there on various forums and YouTube videos and things for people who are taking their time to showcase the functionalities of this tool completely for free. And I think that it's so interesting to see how even just this one tiny little aspect of the work that I do, which is how we format and analyze data, has shifted so quickly in just a few years to this new platform that is completely different from what I'm used to working with and what I was used to working with in the years prior to that. So I think that's a huge change, and it's exciting though. It's so important for people to have those basic coding skills.
It's tremendous. Peter, last thoughts and questions.
Well, you're reminding me. I for some years at George Washington, I was the director of our PhD program for the whole school. I think there were a couple hundred students in the program, and we had, 11 or 12 different fields of concentration for the PhD. And one of my favorite questions as the director of the program, which I would frequently ask students to reflect on, was, they call it a PhD. The joke is filed higher and deeper, but, it really is the philosophy of your subject. And what is the philosophy of your subject? There is no short answer to that. But with all the preoccupation that the program demands with content, technical content of whatever the field is, it's easy to forget that somewhere in the background is a commitment to understand the philosophy of the field. And the philosophy of the field is not an algorithm, and it's not a list, and it's not a couple of Venn diagrams for a PowerPoint presentation. And I don't know if you've had any occasion thus far to reflect on what the philosophy of organizational science, organization theory, organization behavior, whatever you want to call it, what the philosophy of that is. And as I say, I'm not asking you necessarily to have that all worked out in your mind, but I'm just wondering if if the broader meaning or the broader justification for the field has crossed your mind as you've worked your way into it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting and philosophical question. I think that the one thing that kind of comes to mind for me is the way that this program in particular has sort of shifted my thinking and the way that I approach a lot of these topics. So the reason that I chose this organizational science program to begin with is it was the only interdisciplinary program that I found that was looking at these problems of organizations in the workplace from an interdisciplinary lens. So if you take, for example, a manager and employee with a poor relationship, what would psychology say about that? Well, they might look at the individual person and their feelings and their perceptions. So we study a psychological perspective. We also study a communication perspective. So how are these two parties communicating or not communicating with each other, and how is that affecting the relationship? We also look at a management perspective. So, what are the things that this person is doing from a leadership perspective, and maybe what policies or practices are in place that are affecting the way that they lead from that perspective. And then lastly, we look at this from a sociological perspective. So how is this relationship situated in society as a greater whole, and what kind of norms and what kind of practices that are bigger than the people, bigger than the individuals, are affecting that relationship. So are there power differences? Are there some kind of biases or stereotypes that are affecting how these people interact with one another? And I think that at least the philosophy or the approach from this program that I'm currently in, that I'm about to be finishing up, is really just the importance of considering multiple perspectives and recognizing that there's not just one way to answer the question or solve the problem, but in fact, by using all of these different lenses, we can really get a much better and more holistic understanding of what's going on, and hopefully arrive at some kind of solution through that process. And that was certainly not the way that I was thinking before I enrolled in this program 4 years ago.
Well, you've once again, your fire metaphor is growing on me, Dave. You have thought a lot about these things, and I congratulate you on it.
Yeah, I agree.
And the question will continue to be alive, especially if your own interests take you into quite technical and esoteric areas. People are going to look at you and your profession and your practice, and they're basically going to say, "What are you all about?" Well, I don't get why society needs one of you, let alone a whole firm of you. And that's
Sure.
where the broader justification for the field and the broader attraction of the field, which as you said, you were attracted by its interdisciplinary quality, and that's what grabbed me also when I moved from the MBA to the doctoral level. And it's proven out that I'm just as happy with the field and my own position in it and my own set of interests as I was when I graduated. And I feel good that I'm able to say that about it. I just wish I was 40 years younger so I could see it develop further. But
Peter and I are looking at you, Brittany, and saying, if only we could be that young.
Going to happen.
Well, it's certainly reassuring to hear that you're still just as engaged and as excited about it now as you were when you first started out. So there is definitely hope.
There is, and I think that's the good place to kind of wrap, because this is the truth of Peter and me and the work we've been doing for the last year and a half. We had 1,000 reasons to say, that's it, we're done. The professorships are over, but we couldn't stop thinking and being like teachers and inquirers, and we sure as heck didn't want to put our little selves in little boxes and be very specialized in what we write and what we speak about. So practice is a 360-degree topless and somewhat bottomless subject, which for some people they'd say, why in heck did you even get into this? Now I think after talking with you, Brittany, we realize we really are on the right track. And join us the next, we'll come back through the ethers 50 years from now, and we're going to say to you, we were right. You're still enthusiastic.
Okay. Yeah, and I will pass that message along to the next generation in my podcast in 30 years down the road as well.
Oh, she's going to be podcasting, Peter. We got something.
Yeah,
and who knows what the next thing will be.
This particular podcast will be on YouTube or someplace in perpetuity.
It'll never go away. It's going to be on the internet. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so great to meet you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for the time.